Donald Trump, as we describe here almost every night, is in a never-ending war with blue states on a whole host of issues. But now he's looking to challenge California because, I want you to get this, the state has done too good a job combating smog and air pollution. They are too clean when it comes to for Trump. So the administration, they're trying to rescind the congressional waiver that lets California set its own car mileage and emission standards, even though the state doesn't want it. And by the way, get this, neither do the automakers. They're on board with California's standards. Now, until Trump became president, neither did most Republicans. For decades, Republicans have been by far of the two parties the loudest when it comes to pushing back issue after issue, saying that they're protecting something known as states' rights. Now, this comes from the 10th Amendment of the Constitution's Bill of Rights. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. And the GOP, they have used state rights many a time. They've used it to argue that states should be allowed to ban same-sex marriage and establish religious freedom laws. They also believe they should allow people to discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation. They've also claimed states' rights to try and kill unions through right-to-work laws that limit union power and automatic dues collections. Now, they cite states' rights when they push for work requirements for Medicaid and other public assistance, and it comes out all the time when we talk about guns. That's why some states allow concealed carry and open carry, because they say states should decide gun laws, not the federal government. So, is this pushback against California legal? And is that hypocrisy when it comes to states' rights an argument can actually be used against this White House? And for that and more, let's bring in our legal panel. You know the guys. Doug Von Oiste, founding partner at Carson Von Oiste. He's also focuses on corporate misconduct, selected by the Legal 500, one of the most influential trial lawyers in the nation and a former prosecutor in the DA's office out on Long Island, and also Mayo Bartlett, an attorney at the law offices of Mayo Bartlett PLLC, former chief of the bias crimes unit at the Westchester County DA's office, and focusing, among other things, civil rights cases. Okay, a little bit of civics here. I went through the 10th Amendment and the idea of states' rights. I mean, this one is bizarro world. Nobody seems to be arguing the auto industry, let alone the state that wants to put it in place. Since then, by the way, a whole host of other states have followed suit, including a lot of states in the Eastern Seaboard as well. Is there a clear line on this, or can the White House basically say in the administration, you know what, take backs, can't do it?
I don't see how they're going to be able to accomplish that, and basically the federal law is a floor. So you're saying that it can't be any worse than what the federal requirements are. States are free to impose more stringent requirements. So New York, for instance, has stricter gun laws than maybe Virginia might have. But certainly the irony also that the EPA and that the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, they were children of Richard Nixon. And to me, that was one of the best accomplishments any president ever had. It helped people intergenerationally. It's still helping people. To attempt to roll that back, and to do so trying to force a state to be less stringent, and then also to attempt to force industry to be less efficient and to pollute more is just, it's awesome.
To inject politics, or I would argue reason in this particular case, this is on the heels, obviously, of what's happened recently with clean water, where they're now letting toxins get dumped back in, and I know you deal with a lot of these things, back into fresh water, into reservoir. I mean, it's just nuts. But okay, you go around the country trying cases. There's different regs in different states, right? As it relates to not just how you can try a case, but how much discretion industry's given over other states, right? It's not a blanket thing across the country.
Not only are there different regulations, there are different laws that when you try a case, you actually have to pull the law out. You could try the same two fact patterns in two different states and have a different law that you're dealing with. Not only the regulations could be different, but the law that the jury has to consider can be different.
And sometimes, obviously, there's a political component to this, depending if the state, what shade of red or blue that it is, they'll go in a different direction. But sometimes there's some practical considerations depending on the state, depending on how much of it's agricultural based versus how much of it is urban or factory driven or whatever else. One size does not always fit all, right?
Well, that is true, yeah. But you know, people do have to realize that this is we're the United States of America, but there are separate states and there's separate governments, and we have a state government, we have a federal government, and they serve two different purposes sometimes, and there are custom reasons why the laws can be different.
In Mayo, the repealing of so many of the prior administrations, we talked earlier in the program about Iran, and really the undoing of that deal. People can disagree, good or bad or whatever, but in many ways it's begat where we are right now in the latest news cycle on this, but it's not a coincidence. The undoing and the, if not chaos, that attempts to come with that, imagine with healthcare even, and even to some degree healthcare, there has been a fact pattern for 3 years, undo everything the last guy just did.
Sure, and it's cumulative because we like to think that the people we support are responsible for the good things and that somebody else is responsible for the bad things, but it's cumulative. So you really are standing on the shoulders of people who've come before you, and they didn't accomplish all of these things in 1 or 2 administrations. Lots of times it took decades for us to get to the point where, thankfully, we have clean air and clean water. No one says, I'm not going to LA for the Olympics because I'm going to get sick. I'm afraid to swim in the water. So when you stop and you contemplate that the actions that are taken right now are setting things in motion that won't be fully felt for several generations. And at that point, they may be irreversible.
And by the way, it brings me to another point. You deal with a lot of cases, obviously, relating to asbestos. Imagine if all of a sudden the president rescinded all the regulations were put in after we understood all the carcinogens, et cetera, that were involved with some of that, and said, go there, do whatever you want. You know, forget OSHA, forget all the rest here. You can do whatever you want to a workplace. Forget any oversight here. In this case, forget about clean air, forget about clean water, whatever the case may be. You're opening yourself up. I would even think as a company, forget about what the feds say you can do. People get sick as a consequence. There's exposure all the way around.
Well, you know, you can look at history. You mentioned OSHA before Nixon. Before 1972, when OSHA was passed, the industry was left to its own devices to regulate itself. So now you have at least a bare minimum where industry had a say in what would be passed with OSHA, but now you have laws that were there to protect the workers.
Okay, the guys are staying with me. When we come back, we're going to do a quick round robin here. The latest in the Varsity Blues admission scandal, Felicity Huffman, she's heading to the big house for a couple of weeks. The question is, did she deserve it, or did her star wattage get her a longer sentence than not, or the other way around? And what about the consequences for Lori Loughlin and a guilty plea of her own? That and more after this.